Hi, this is Rob Liddell. I'm in the history department at the University of Rhode Island, and we're here continuing our series of conversations with folks that have been involved in Freedom Summer and in civil rights movement and other activities in the 1960s and up since that point. And I'll let David introduce himself, and we'll just have some conversation after that. So, David.
I'm David Riley. I live in Providence. I was in Mississippi in Vicksburg for the summer of 1964 and also the fall, and went back for about a month in the summer of 1965. And I'm glad to be here. I appreciate you doing this.
So I guess the way I like to start it is hear a little bit about where you grew up and where you were from and what sort of led you to actually become involved here. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, with virtually no exposure to people of color. I mean, some maids, and that was pretty much it. And Hartford and other parts of Connecticut also, outside of Waterbury. And then I think what kind of set the germ, I guess, was my senior year. I went to a prep school, Hill School in Pennsylvania, and my senior year I spent a weekend in Philadelphia with the American Friends Service Committee, and that was a real eye-opener. I remember getting off the train and asking the bus driver where Diamond Street was, and he said, "Diamond Street? You want to go to Diamond Street?" We stayed in a settlement house there, and we did some painting, as I remember. And we also picketed the Woolworths counter, which was segregated at the time, or maybe the employees were segregated. I don't know, but I remember picketing Woolworths in downtown Philadelphia. And we went to what they called, quote unquote, drunk court on Sunday morning, and that was an eye-opener. And then we went to a black church, which was really an eye-opener. So that was my senior year in high school. Then I went to college, went to Middlebury in Vermont, and because they required at that time six chapel, you had to go to chapel 6 times a semester or a chapel lecture. Because of that, I went to hear William Sloane Coffin, and he changed my life. He changed a lot of people's lives, but he had just come back. This was in my freshman year. No, it was my sophomore year, I guess. Beginning of my sophomore year, and he had just come back from leading Operation Crossroads Africa, which was a summer work project, and he was full of that, and I immediately applied for that, and that really changed my life. But I remember he said during that talk, one of the things he said which really struck me is that he said, "How many Jews are there in your parents' country club? And if you don't know, why not?" Anyway, so I then went to Operation Crossroads Africa in Senegal, which was the summer of 1962 after my sophomore year. And that was huge exposure, obviously, to black people. And we built a school dormitory in a fishing village, and it was a wonderful experience. And then I spent my junior year in Paris after that, and I came back to Middlebury my senior year, and immediately got involved in the civil rights movement. As it happened, George Wallace, who was giving a talk at Dartmouth, which is not too far from Middlebury, and I organized a bus load. I thought it was important to go hear him as a way of becoming more aware of racial issues. And so we did that, and I wrote an article about it for the student magazine, and then I said, well, why don't we see if we can get Malcolm X to come to the college? And the new president of the college was not excited about that. And so we had to go around, and he finally said, if the student leaders approve it, then you can invite him. By the time the student leaders approved it, which they did, his schedule was full. So they said, we'll send you James X or somebody, but it didn't quite do it, so it didn't happen. But anyway, I continued to be involved in my senior year, and in the spring heard Al Lowenstein talk in, I think it was Haverford, about going to Mississippi, and I signed up.
When you went on, this weekend, in high school, I mean, was it completely out of the blue for you to have done something like that, or was it something that had been germinating for a little bit?
Well, it's interesting. As I was describing it to you, I kind of wondered what the germ for that was, and I don't really know. The only thing that comes to mind is that my grandmother, who died when I was 6, I didn't really know her, but she was very involved in or actually maybe it was my great-grandmother, in starting the PTA and nationally. And my parents were not socially active, or not politically active at all. My father, they were basically Republicans. My mother voted for Nixon and immediately regretted it in 1960. They weren't particularly, I remember when I left home to go to Mississippi, it was the day after Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were reported missing. And it was on the front page of the New York Times that day. And my father, who was not particularly communicative, said something like, as I was leaving, "Well, don't go get yourself killed." That was about as close as he came to being supportive. My mother, on the other hand, was supportive, and later in the fall, we got somebody to donate a station wagon, and she and a friend of hers drove the station wagon down to Mississippi, which was pretty great. So I don't know where it came from, really. I don't.
And so you went, and I'll make sure I get the timing right. So you first went to Mississippi. It was in the summer of '64.
Yeah.
And you had graduated from college the previous spring.
That June, right? May.
And had at that point, the United States had seen a whole host of civil rights activities, and so was it something that you had been following pretty closely as a student, and thinking that when I graduate I want to get involved in this, or was it something else that
No, I think being in Africa and being around black people, really for the first time getting to know people of color, was just, I mean, I saw the humanity, you couldn't miss it, and I hadn't before. And so and then there was all this fervor happening. And so when I came back, I mean, when I was in Paris, obviously I wasn't involved, but as soon as I got back, which was the fall of my senior year, the fall of '63, I knew that it was really important for me to be involved, and so I got involved. When I was in college, I did some organizing.
Right. Fall of '63 is, of course, when the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church happens, and so there's lots of stuff going on. Right after the March on Washington, the previous August, and so on.
I thought about going to the March on Washington, and I actually was doing a writers' conference at the time, and I had just gotten back, but I wish I had.
So you decide, that you're going to, get involved. Did you then? Were you one of the ones that then went to Ohio to do training? Before you went down to Mississippi? Was that?
I did do it. Well, it was required to do an orientation, and I did not go to Ohio because I went a little bit later.
Okay.
I actually drove down. I left Connecticut on June 23rd. I know that because that was the day the article was in the New York Times on the front page about Schwerner, Goodman, Cheney. And I stayed with my sister, who was in Washington, D.C., and I went to see both senators, as we'd been asked to do, both senators from Connecticut, Ribicoff and Dodd, as well as my congressman from Connecticut, urging them to send federal protection. They'd asked us to do that. I didn't get a very receptive response from either of them. I think they kind of thought I was a young whippersnapper, which I was. But and then I went to Chapel Hill and stayed with my sister's in-laws, and they introduced me to some people who worked in civil rights there, and went to Atlanta and then on to Memphis, where I had the orientation, and that was a powerful experience. Interestingly, very close friend of my parents said, "Oh, you're going to Memphis, please stay with my sister," who lived in Memphis. And so I arrived there like, I don't know, 10, 11 at night, and she showed me to a room, and the next morning I came down to breakfast with her, my parents' friend's sister, and her husband, and we sat out on the veranda and had breakfast, and after breakfast, on my way to go to the orientation, she took me aside and said, I'm afraid my husband will have a heart attack if you stay here. So that was the end of their Southern hospitality. And I went to and stayed in the dorm in Lemoyne College.
Oh. And so you were probably there for a week or 2 weeks.
I think 4 or 5 days. I remember.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, something like that.
And then did you drive in from there across the river?
Yes, I did on a Sunday morning.
And so when you when you arrived in Mississippi, I'm gonna guess, maybe I shouldn't, that this was your first time in Mississippi. Was it a shock to you, in any way, or was it, you just sort of jumped in and found who you needed to find and got to work and got going, or what was that first?
I remember it very well. But before I mention that, just one thing I want to say about the orientation, which are two things actually. One was that they said there were some SNCC people there, including Ivanhoe Donaldson and some others. He was very involved with SNCC. And one of the things they said was, they said, we're sure that some other people are going to get killed this summer, and there's no shame in not coming. This is the time to turn around if you want to. I don't remember anybody turning around, although some may have. And I also remember doing a role play where we were, being attacked by the Klan. That was a little scary. And I also remember, his first name was Grady, I forget his last name now. Wonderful African-American minister from Washington who said that the president of Harvard had on his desk a statue, a little sculpture of a turtle, and underneath it says, "Remember the turtle, he makes progress when he sticks his neck out." So that was powerful. The orientation was powerful. And then, I don't know how, but somehow I got assigned to Vicksburg, and I do remember driving in. It was a beautiful sunny morning, a Sunday sunny morning, I think the very beginning of July. And I was struck by the fact that it looked normal. I mean, we drove down the highway, and it hit me that, yes, there was violence or fear of violence, and there was intimidation, beatings, and so forth. But when people get up and go to the church and go to the supermarket, and it looks normal, and that was startling to me. That violence is there, but it's unless you're in war, it's not. It doesn't hit you in the face necessarily. So that was interesting. And then we went to Vicksburg and stayed with a family, this wonderful family, the Chiplins. There were 3 or 4 of us staying there in a little shotgun rectangular house in what they call the Bottom, in Marcus Bottom. Vicksburg is on the river. Some of it's quite high and bluffs over the river, and basically the white people, it's kind of a checkerboard. The white people lived up on the higher streets that were paved, and most of the black people lived in the lower streets that were unpaved, that were more mosquitoes and swampy, and that's where we stayed.
And what kind of work did they have you doing?
Well, initially we did voter registration, and they said, is anybody interested in being part of what they call the quote-unquote white folks project, which was kind of a smaller, the big focus was voter registration in community centers and freedom schools, and we had a very viable, active freedom school, lots of kids coming up there. I did voter registration and tried to do the white folks project, but there was a priest that we met with, Catholic priest, and he met with us at night, as I remember, and talked about maybe one or two people might meet with us, but nobody did. We did get a bunch of phone calls at our headquarters. That was kind of the closest thing we had contact with white people. I mean, just other than the sheriff. I do remember a couple of phone calls. One was, you know, if you had a thoroughbred, if you had racehorses, wouldn't you want a thoroughbred? That was one. And another one was, there was a delivery man up there recently. He said he saw a black girl sitting on the couch with no pants on. Is that right? That wasn't the word they used, but anyway, that was kind of our extent of our contact with the white community.
So how long then were you in Vicksburg?
July and August.
July and August.
And we went door to door with voter registration. We broke the city up into wards, and it was clear that people were hugely intimidated. And a lot of times we'd I remember going to doors and going to houses, knocking on the door, and you know, an older man or woman would answer the door, and right away, Yassa? Hi, I'm David. Yassa? Would you like to register to vote? Yassa? But you know, they're rightfully terrified, and so and then the strategy I think changed, although maybe they'd planned it all along, and that was to have our own registration form, not an official one, to register people for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and we did a lot of that. And I remember going to and then the idea was to have a parallel structure to the regular party, and we had a town Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party town meeting, and then a county convention, and they sent delegates to the state convention, which I went to in Jackson, and then they sent a delegation to Atlantic City, which I did not go to. I came back. We put out a little newspaper, started a newspaper right then, the end of August, a black community civil rights newspaper. And I spent the month of September in the North raising money and attracting interest for it. Spoke to William Sloane Coffin at Yale and got somebody to donate. I called Polaroid. They sent us a Polaroid camera, and somebody sent us a printer that we could use, a press. Then I went back in the very beginning of October to run the paper with some local people.
Did you have some sense when you were there in those first couple of months that you felt like you were making some sort of progress in some ways, or was it difficult to keep going? What was it like for you to do that? That's at times sort of tedious work of knocking on doors and talking to people who aren't always ready to talk to you. Were you able to keep your enthusiasm?
Absolutely.
And your commitment?
Because the people, the black people that were there, they just opened their arms to us. I mean, the family I stayed with was a wonderful couple. They had 6 kids. Most of them were grown. A couple of them were still living there, and they opened their arms and their hearts to us, and you couldn't help but fall in love with them. And I remember one guy in particular, Pink Taylor was his name, and they called him Pink Taylor, and he was, I don't know, probably 75 or something, and he had been a porter in the railroad for his whole adult life. He was retired, and you can imagine what segregation he lived with for 30 or 40 years. And he and his wife, there must have been 15 of us in Vicksburg, and people would have us, all of us, over for dinner in these modest houses regularly. And he had a truck, he had a pickup truck, and he drove us around everywhere. He had this high-pitched voice, and he was just like the soul of goodness. But other people too, not just him, lots of people. So, it was a very powerful experience. I remember going out into the county. Sometimes we'd go out into the county. Vicksburg is on the river, but it's also it's parallel to Jackson, meaning that there's the southwest corner of Mississippi was just directly south of Vicksburg, and they said, they forbid us to go there. There was Macomb and Natchez and been a lot of violence down. I guess later they did open an office in Macomb, but they said don't go wandering around. We did sometimes go out into the county, Warren County, which is around Vicksburg. And I remember going to a black church in the county one time, this modest building, and during the service they asked us to come and talk about, or we asked to go, and they said you're welcome to come. And I remember talking about, there was a song during the service about when I get to heaven I'm going to wear golden slippers or something. So then I got up to talk and I said, well, it's great singing about that, but what about shoes here on earth? And the place erupted. They just, started cheering, and the whole idea was to let people know what we were doing and get people to sign the registration form. Mm-hmm. So no, it wasn't discouraging because there was so much support and so much appreciation.
Mm-hmm. And when did your mom show up? When was she?
That wasn't until
the
the fall.
Following?
Yeah, okay. I came back in the beginning of October, and that was interesting too because I came back on the 3rd of October, and I got there late one night, and I spent the night in our office. There was a room, and there were some people who stayed in the building where our office was. And so I stayed in this bed on the 2nd floor, and then the next night I was going to stay there. I think I remember fell asleep at 9, got up at 10, and decided to go stay with the family that I lived with for the summer. They had encouraged me to come back, and I was planning to do that. So about 3 hours later, about 3 in the morning, the phone rang, and the place had been bombed, and the bed that I had been sleeping in was half down the hole, not half, but partly down the hole where the bomb was. So that was intense. And then I was sitting that day, I think, or maybe the next day. That day, I think that I was sitting in the office. It was kind of in shambles, hadn't been really hurt. The only part of the house had been hurt by the bomb. And the mail arrived. And my mother had given me a subscription, which I didn't realize, to the Middlebury College newspaper. And I opened the newspaper, and William Sloane Coffin was speaking that night at Middlebury. I had just been to visit him to ask him to help with raising money a couple of weeks before when I was up there. So I called the college. He was out to dinner, and he called back just before he went on to speak with the students. And I said, in a place has been bombed, can you ask him to send some money, send some clothes for the community center, some books for the Freedom Center? And they did. They sent, I think it was like $600, a bunch of books, and well, that was kind of fun.
So you were there. So when you came back in October, and then how long you were there for?
October and November, and about half of December, or maybe.
And then so that's when your mom showed up with the
she showed up. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so I was curious. So what was that like when when she emerged in Mississippi?
I don't remember too much about her being there. I'm sure she met the Mr. and Mrs. Chiplin, who I stayed with, and was charmed. They were both charmed by each other, I'm sure. As it happened, just a couple of things about the Chiplins. Charles Chiplin was the son, who was 15 at the time. He was living there, and his older siblings were not. And his younger sister, Jessie, was living there too. So when we went back, as I was telling you earlier, last June for the 50th reunion, my wife Mimo and I went back, and all 6 of our kids came with us because they really wanted to see it, and we wanted them to. And we made contact. Unfortunately, Charles, who Mimo and I saw 5 years ago, a wonderful man, wrote a book about his family and called Roads from the Bottom. And Jessie, so he had died, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, but we saw Jessie and another sister of hers. And Jessie said at one point, we got together, they invited, it was like when we were there in the summer, they just had us over and they gave us meals. And Jessie at one point said, I have to make a confession. When you were in our house, she was 13, you went off to work during the day, and I went into your suitcase. And I found all these books by black authors. I had written a thesis for my senior year about, it was a history major, but it was about James Baldwin and Richard Wright. So I had these books by Richard Wright and James Baldwin. Shit, I read those books. I didn't know these kinds of books existed. So I read Giovanni's Room, and I read all this great stuff. That was kind of fun.
So then you were there in the fall of '64. Where did you go from there? Where did life take you from there?
Yeah, well, I was there to get the newspaper going, and this wonderful woman named Mrs. Irwin worked with me, and then she ran it after I left. It went for a couple of years, and we had covered the white newspaper. If it mentioned black people at all, it was never with a salutation like Mr. and Mrs., and it was, they didn't cover it like the black high school and the sports events and the achievements and nothing like that. So this paper did that, as well as Civil Rights News. Anyway, so then I went to Colorado in December, I don't know, third week in December or whatever, and got married, and my wife at the time was finishing college in Boulder, and I I audited some courses and wrote things for the paper in Mississippi, like events that had happened around the country that were relevant, which they published. And then I went to law school. I went back that summer for a month and lived with, I can't remember where we lived actually, probably with the same family, yeah. And worked with a newspaper, and then went to law school in Washington, George Washington Law School.
So when you found yourself, in law school and so what were there ways that this experience doing the work you've been doing in Mississippi, I mean, did that that inform what you were doing in law school and what you were doing?
Totally.
How did it do that?
Totally. Yeah, I got when I went to law school, I was thinking maybe I would do civil rights law or civil liberties law, and I immediately got involved in the anti-war movement. I was in a lot of marches on the Mall. As a law student, I sometimes wore a band, indicating that I was a law student and helping out. And I remember getting tear gassed outside the Justice Department. And we did a little civil disobedience. Was that when I was still in law school? I think it was after I graduated, actually. Spent 17 hours in a two-man jail cell with 20 other people, and so yeah, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and then when I finished law school, I worked on housing and urban issues at a progressive institute, and then I did freelance writing, wrote some articles about social issues, and so progressive issues, and then got divorced and remarried, and lived in Vermont for a number of years, did some writing and teaching there, then went back to Washington and worked on arms control and worked with Friends of the Earth and on arms control issues, worked on the nuclear freeze campaign, wrote some fact sheets that were used around the country, I think, and did that, and then I worked on arms control issues, and then I did more freelance writing and ended up moving in 1998 to Providence. Yeah.
So did you have a sense as you were doing some of these subsequent things in the 1970s and into the 1980s? I mean, did you have a sense that this was all the same work that you had been doing? I mean, was it a pretty seamless transition for you? Because one of the things that historians always point out when we think about this is that the world around some of this stuff is changing, right? As you're going from the 1960s into the 1970s into the 1980s, the political context and the economic context is changing. But was that was that something that you could feel in the work that you were doing, or was there was it more just sort of you were plugged in and doing the things you need to do regardless of what was going on?
Oh no, I was very involved in the anti-war movement and the arms control, environmental issues. In Providence, I got involved with a lot, and still involved with a lot of community activism, trying to get public use of the waterfront and so forth. So the issues, changed in the sense that they weren't strictly civil rights, but the theme of helping to bring about change and empowering people who aren't necessarily in power has remained from back then. Definitely. It was such a heady experience at 22. I remember we had after the office was bombed, we had a meeting out in a registration meeting out in a rural church. Actually, I didn't go to that meeting, but it was shot up. They were having the meeting and gunshots came in, people hit the floor and they left. So we immediately planned a meeting the next week, same time, same place. Only that time some of our friends, black farmers, let us in with shotguns in their trucks and stood out in the fields. I was at that, but the white newspaper said after the meeting was shot up, the sheriff said he went out and looked at the church and didn't see any bullet holes. So I went out and took pictures with our little Polaroid camera, and I remember accosting the sheriff on the steps of the courthouse and said, Sheriff Luckett, his name was, would you like to see these pictures? Oh, no, I don't want to see any pictures. We published them in our newspaper. So it was a heady experience, they kind of had to pay attention. In a sense, they clearly were paying attention to us when they bombed us. So yeah.
And you're now, as you said, up in Providence. How did you end up in Providence?
Well, my wife and I wanted to get back closer to New England when we got married. My younger son was just starting high school, and I said, I'm not going to leave D.C. until he finishes. And so she came down, and then we wanted to get closer to. She grew up a lot in the summer in Maine, and wanted to get nearer to Maine, and I did too. I wanted to get out of Washington, so we kind of chose Providence. We wanted a small city on the water. We got it.
And I guess and I say this with every interview, and those of you who watch, all of them, right? We'll see it. But I'd love to explore some of the other stuff that you were talking about and get more in details on some things. But a little bit short on time
right.
to fit all the interviews in.
Right.
But is sort of a way of concluding. Is there and we've talked about this in a little bit, just a moment ago. But in the work that you've done, for example, in trying to open up the waterfront, so were there, do you feel like the strategies or the tactics that you learned about and honed in Mississippi, are those the same kinds of things that you're using?
Yeah, basically.
In this other work that you've done?
Yeah, it's all about organizing and making contacts with people. One of the things I like about the work that I do, the community activism I do, is I see it as a gigantic puzzle. And the challenge is to find the right people, to talk to the right people at the right time, and with a piece of paper that's gets the important facts across, but is succinct, so they'll read it. And that was true. It was true in Mississippi. Yeah, it definitely was true in Mississippi. It was true in arms control work. Very true there. and anti-war work too. It's all about putting people together, organizing. So yeah, it comes from Mississippi. Yeah.
Finally, one of the things we've been asking folks is, if there's if you could comment a little bit on what you sort of see as opportunities today for some of the students that I have here at University of Rhode Island, or that are looking for ways to take work that they've done in their classes, or those kinds of things, but to get themselves involved in things. Are there things that you think that they can take from your story that you would say to them about how to do that, how to find those kinds of opportunities?
Well, I think they're all around. I mean, I gave a talk at our 50th college reunion with some other people about experiences in the 60s, and that question came up, what can we do in our communities? And my answer was, there's 10 or 15 great things you can do to help people. You just have to choose one. I mean, it could be Planned Parenthood, it could be working with a local church, it could be civil liberties group, whatever, poverty, affordable housing. There's no lack of things to do that can be helpful. You just have to choose something that turns you on, and then devote some time to it. I think that there's been research done recently. A guy named Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist at Penn and who's written a lot about not just, he kind of asked the question, why is psychology so focused on mental illness and how to treat it, and not very much on mental health and how to encourage it? And one of the things he said in his writing, and other people have written similar things, is that if you're involved in something bigger than yourself, at least, whether it's a vocation or an avocation, it gives, in my experience, it's very rewarding. It gives you a sense of, it gives me energy and excitement, and also, to the extent that it succeeds, which it can if you stick at it long enough, or at least partially. I think it makes life richer, as not just for the society and the cause, but for the individual, at least for me. And I think there's been research suggesting that other people feel that way.
I talk to my students about the difference between your career and your work.
About what?
The difference between your career and your work, and sometimes those align, but sometimes you have to figure out what your work's going to be. So.
Yeah. Can I say two more things quickly?
Absolutely.
One of the things that struck me when we were in Mississippi in Jackson for the conference, Bob Moses, who was an extraordinary man. I mean, I remember so clearly being at meetings, 50 years ago, and there'd be like 300 people in the room, and he talked like I'm talking, and everybody listened. And I just really appreciated his whole manner of leading by example and rather than by harangue. But he said during the conference, I thought it was so interesting, I wish I had written down the exact words, but the gist of it was that the oppressed have a lot more fear and anxiety than the oppressors have a lot more fear and anxiety than the oppressed, which is so interesting. Here people are getting beaten and killed and denied their rights, and you go to church, and I mean, it's true today, and you get all this amazing joy. And it's not joy without focusing on what needs to be done. It's both. And then, I know you have to be careful not to stereotype, but a lot of times you see people, with these who are quote unquote the oppressors, that is people quote in power, and there's a strain and anger and fear in their faces, and I thought that was so startling that he said that. And the other thing I want to say is that one of the refreshing things about being in Mississippi and reconnecting with our friends there, including the Shirleys, who we worked with, another group that we saw and that took us around, they're so open about talking about race. It's so refreshing. I mean, why wouldn't they? Because it's such a dominant part of their lives, was and still is. But I found that wonderful.
different from your experience here? And
Yeah, I mean, it's different for one thing. And Mississippi is almost 40% black. Most black people of any state in the country. So, you know, it makes sense that the issues are more prominent. But it's so nice. I don't know. And just being around, I wish I were around black people more than I am. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience.
Great. Well, thank you for
Thank you.
agreeing to sit with us, and we'll have a chance to talk more. Maybe we'll get to do an extended interview at some point also,
Right.
where I can subject you to the full oral history,
Okay.
experience.
That would be great.
Great.
Good. Thank you.